Late October, 1881. Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory. When Elias Kern started digging beneath his livestock barn, his neighbors assumed he'd lost his mind. A homesteader building shelter under his animals? It looked like desperation wrapped in insanity. But what they saw as surrender to poverty would become the warmest structure within 50 miles, a dwelling that defied every assumption about frontier housing while consuming half the firewood of conventional cabins. What did this struggling farmer understand about thermal engineering that experienced builders completely missed? If you want to discover one survival technique every week that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story is about to change how you think about winter shelter. Elias Kern wasn't a builder. He wasn't an engineer. He was a 32-year-old farmer from Pennsylvania who'd arrived in Wyoming Territory with his wife Margaret and 2 young daughters in the spring of 1881, carrying little more than determination and the promise of 160 acres under the Homestead Act. By June, he'd managed to raise a simple pole barn for his 3 cows and small flock of chickens. The structure stood 12 feet tall, built from lodgepole pine logs with a sod roof, functional, weathertight, and exactly what his limited resources allowed. The plan had been straightforward: build the barn first, then construct a proper cabin before snow fell. But plans and reality rarely align on the frontier. A late summer hailstorm destroyed his first wheat crop. An early September frost killed his vegetable garden. By mid-October, with temperatures already dropping below freezing at night, Elias faced a brutal calculation. He had neither the money for milled lumber nor the time to cut and season enough logs for a traditional cabin. Winter in the Wind River Valley didn't negotiate. Historical records show temperatures regularly plunged to 20 below zero, with wind chills driving the effective temperature even lower. Margaret was pragmatic about their situation. "We need walls and a roof before the hard freeze," she told him one evening as they huddled in their wagon, their breath visible in the October air. "I don't care what it looks like." Elias stared at the barn. The livestock would survive in 3-sided shelters. He'd seen cattle winter outdoors in Pennsylvania. But his family needed real protection. The barn already had walls, a roof, and most critically, it was finished. What if, instead of starting from nothing, he built within what already existed? The idea felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Homesteaders built separate structures. Humans and animals occupied different spaces. Living beneath your livestock wasn't housing. It was admission of failure. But as wind rattled the wagon canvas that night, wrong started to feel like the only option that might keep his daughters alive. He started digging the next morning. The plan emerged through necessity rather than design. He would excavate 18 inches into the earth along the barn's north wall, creating a semi-dugout space. The barn's existing log walls would become the outer shell. He'd construct interior walls 3 feet inside the barn walls, creating a double wall cavity. The livestock would remain in the barn's southern half, separated by a solid partition. His family would occupy the northern section, insulated by earth below, air cavity around, animals to the south, and sod roof above. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't conventional. But Elias had noticed something during his months in the territory. The earth itself maintained a constant temperature several feet down. Root cellars stayed cool in summer and prevented freezing in winter. If he could combine earth sheltering with the barn's existing wind protection and the passive heat from livestock, he might create something more efficient than a standard cabin. His neighbor, Robert Hutchins, a weathered homesteader who'd survived 5 Wyoming winters, stopped by on the 3rd day of excavation. He watched Elias hauling dirt from beneath the barn floor, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to pity. "You planning to winter in there?" Hutchins asked, gesturing at the growing pit. "I am, under the barn, with the animals. Next to them, not under them," Elias corrected, though he knew the distinction wouldn't matter to anyone else. "Separate quarters." Hutchins shook his head slowly. "Elias, a man's got to have standards. There's poor, and then there's this. You're going to smell like cow dung all winter. You're going to freeze because you're half underground. And when spring comes, Everyone's going to remember you as the man who lived like livestock. The word stung because they echoed Elias's own doubts. But he kept digging. By early November, the mockery had spread beyond Hutchins. At the general store in Lander, 15 miles south, people referred to his place as Kern's stable home. A carpenter named William Pritchard, whose cabins were considered the finest in the valley, made his opinion clear to anyone who'd listen. That fool's building a tomb. Underground, no proper chimney draft, moisture from animals and earth. He'll suffocate or freeze, probably both. I give them until January. Even Margaret's sister, who lived in a proper cabin 30 miles east, sent a letter that November. Please tell me the rumors aren't true. Please tell me you haven't moved my sister and nieces into a barn. But Elias had committed. The interior walls were up. Rough pine boards with a 6-inch gap from the barn's outer logs, stuffed with dry grass for insulation. He dug the floor 18 inches down and covered it with flat stones salvaged from a nearby creek, creating thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. A small cast-iron stove sat in the corner, with a stovepipe running up through the sod roof. 3 small windows faced south, positioned to catch winter sun. The ceiling was just under 7 feet, low by conventional standards but less air to heat. On November 12, 1881, with the first major snowstorm visible on the western horizon, Elias moved his family from the wagon into their underground quarters beneath the barn. His daughters thought it was an adventure. Margaret kept her doubts private, and their neighbors assumed they'd made a terrible mistake that winter would cruelly correct. What Elias Kern had accidentally engineered was a multi-layered thermal system that worked with natural physics rather than fighting against them. He didn't think of it in those terms. He wasn't educated in thermodynamics or architectural theory. But desperation and observation had led him to combine several principles that conventional cabin builders in Wyoming territory consistently ignored. The foundation started below frost line. By excavating 18 inches and flooring the space with creek stone, Elias had created direct contact with earth that maintained a relatively constant temperature of roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. While surface temperatures swung from summer highs of 85 degrees Fahrenheit to winter lows of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, the ground 18 inches down remained thermally stable. This meant his floor would never drop to the brutal temperatures that made conventional wooden cabin floors feel like standing on ice. The stone floor served a second function, thermal mass. During the day, when the small stove burned and weak winter sunlight came through the south-facing windows, the stones absorbed heat. At night, as air temperature dropped, those stones released their stored warmth slowly, creating a radiant heating effect from below. It was the same principle behind Russian stoves and Korean ondol systems, though Elias had never heard of either. Above the floor, the double-wall design created what modern engineers would call a thermal envelope. The barn's outer log walls, each log roughly 10 inches in diameter, provided the first barrier against wind and precipitation. 3 feet inward, Elias's interior walls of rough-sawn pine boards created a second barrier. The 6-inch gap between these walls was loosely packed with dry prairie grass, creating dead air space and additional insulation. Cold air couldn't convect rapidly through this cavity, and the grass prevented it from circulating freely. But here's what made neighbors call him crazy. The barn walls themselves weren't perfectly sealed. Small gaps between logs allowed minimal air exchange, just enough to prevent moisture buildup without creating drafts. Elias had noticed this during construction. Conventional cabins with perfectly chinked walls often develop condensation problems because there was nowhere for moisture from cooking, breathing, and drying clothes to escape. His semi-permeable outer wall allowed moisture to dissipate, while the tight inner wall maintained living space comfort. The livestock, separated from the living quarters by a solid partition but sharing the overall barn structure, contributed passive heat. 3 dairy cows and a dozen chickens generated approximately 1,500 to 2,000 BTUs of heat per hour combined. Not enough to heat the space alone, but enough to keep the barn's interior temperature several degrees above outdoor ambient. That heat radiated into the air cavity around Elias's living quarters, pre-warming the thermal envelope before cold air could penetrate to the inner walls. The ceiling design solved a problem Elias had observed in other cabins: heat stratification. In tall-ceilinged frontier cabins, the warmest air rose to the rafters while occupants froze at floor level. By keeping his ceiling under 7 feet, Elias created less vertical space for heat to escape to unused areas. The sod roof above, 14 inches of prairie earth and grass roots, provided exceptional insulation while its mass prevented rapid heat loss. Finally, there was the stove placement and chimney design. Elias positioned his small cast-iron stove in the northwest corner, the coldest point where prevailing winds hit hardest. The stovepipe ran up through the interior space for 6 feet before entering the roof, meaning all that chimney heat radiated into the living area rather than being wasted in an exterior chimney. The chimney itself extended only 3 feet above the sod roof, short enough to minimize heat loss, but adequate for draft because the sod roof's mass created sufficient pressure differential. To anyone walking past, it looked like poverty and poor planning. The structure sat lower than conventional cabins. It had no impressive log construction visible from outside. It shared walls with a barn. It looked, frankly, like exactly what it was: a desperate family making do with insufficient resources. But the physics didn't care about appearances. What Elias had created was essentially a passive solar earth-sheltered dwelling with integrated livestock heating, multi-layer insulation, thermal mass flooring, and optimized ceiling height, all constructed accidentally through practical observation rather than theoretical knowledge. Robert Hutchins, examining the interior one cold November afternoon, summarized the prevailing opinion. "It's clever, I'll give you that. Might even work through December. But when January hits and you're trying to heat all this earth and stone, and that weak little stove can't keep up, and moisture from the ground starts condensing on everything, you'll understand why we build proper cabins up off the ground with good ventilation." William Pritchard, the master carpenter, was less generous. "You've built a cave with extra steps. Humans evolved to live above ground for reasons. That stone floor will suck heat right out of your body. Those sod roofs collapse under snow load. And living this close to animals, the ammonia from their waste will make you sick. This isn't innovation, Kern. It's just being too stubborn to admit you can't afford proper housing." Even Margaret had concerns she didn't voice. The interior was dark. Small windows didn't lend much light. The ceiling felt oppressive. The smell from the livestock section, while not overwhelming, was definitely present. And yes, it did feel strange to have their bedroom separated from cows by a single wall. But Elias noticed something his critics didn't. On November nights, when the temperature dropped to 15 degrees outside, the interior of their quarters held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit with just a small fire in the stove. Not warm by comfort standards, but far above freezing. And the space felt warmer than the thermometer suggested because the floor radiated gentle heat and the walls weren't actively cold to the touch. He also noticed that the moisture everyone predicted hadn't materialized. The air felt dry, not damp. Condensation didn't form on windows or walls. And despite the livestock presence, air quality remained reasonable because the semi-permeable barn walls allowed gas exchange without creating drafts. Give it time, Hutchins predicted. Real winter hasn't even started. He was right about that. Real winter was coming, and it would settle every argument with numbers that couldn't be disputed. December 1881 arrived with temperatures that reminded settlers why Wyoming Territory had a reputation for breaking families. The mercury dropped below zero and stayed there for 11 consecutive days. Winds swept down from the mountains with the kind of sustained force that found every gap in every wall, turning conventional cabins into wind tunnels that devoured firewood without producing proportional warmth. For the Kern family in their barn shelter, it was their first real test. For their neighbors, it was vindication waiting to happen. The social judgment had intensified as word spread beyond the immediate valley. At church services in Lander, Margaret heard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. A woman from a neighboring homestead, someone she'd considered friendly, pulled her aside after one service with concern that felt more like condescension. "Margaret, dear, I know times are hard, but there are limits. My husband says if things get desperate for you all, we might have space in our barn. Our actual barn, I mean, for storage." The message was clear. "We know you're living in conditions meant for animals." Elias faced more direct criticism. At the general store, loading supplies he could barely afford, William Pritchard cornered him near the lumber section. The carpenter had built 4 cabins that fall, and clearly felt this gave him authority. "Kern, I'm saying this as a Christian and a neighbor. You're endangering your family with this experiment." Pritchard's voice carried across the store, drawing attention. "I've built structures in this territory for 8 years. I understand timber, ventilation, and heat retention. What you've built violates every principle of sound construction." "It's warm," Elias replied quietly, trying to end the conversation. "For now. Wait until January when the real cold hits. Wait until that sod roof gets saturated with snow and the weight starts pressing down. Wait until the moisture from underground starts rotting your interior walls." Pritchard warmed to his subject, enjoying the audience. "You think you're being resourceful. What you're actually doing is too stubborn to admit you made poor financial decisions and can't provide proper housing." Other men in the store nodded agreement. These were experienced frontiersmen, people who'd survived multiple Wyoming winters. Their skepticism wasn't baseless. They'd seen plenty of unconventional structures fail, often with tragic consequences. A rancher named Cotton spoke up. "My cousin tried something similar in Montana. Half-dugout design. Thought the earth would keep him warm. Found him in March, frozen solid." Sometimes old methods exist for good reasons. The implied threat hung in the air. Your daughters might freeze because of your pride. Elias left the store without responding. What could he say? He wasn't educated. He hadn't built cabins before. His design was based on desperation and half-understood observations about root cellars and animal shelters. Maybe they were right. Maybe he'd made a terrible mistake that would become obvious when temperature extremes revealed the flaws in his improvisation. But the thermometer in his quarters told a different story. On December 8th, when morning temperature outside hit -6 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior measured 48 degrees Fahrenheit, with no fire burning since the previous evening. The stone floor felt cool, but not cold. The air was still and comfortable. Margaret could dress the girls without them shivering uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Robert Hutchins was burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate. His well-built, conventional cabin, logs properly chinked, raised on a foundation to prevent ground moisture, with a tall ceiling and good ventilation, required constant feeding of his large fireplace to maintain 55 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature. On the coldest nights, despite burning wood continuously, the temperature near the floor dropped into the 40s. But Hutchins didn't share these struggles. Admitting his cabin was inefficient would validate Kern's strange design, and frontier pride ran deep. Better to assume Kern was lying about his interior temperatures, or that disaster was still coming. The true test arrived on December 19th. A blizzard swept down from the north. Not just snow, but the kind of sustained, brutal storm that veteran settlers recognized as life-threatening. Temperatures plunged to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills driving the effective temperature far lower. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, finding every crack, every gap, every weakness in structures that seemed solid during calm weather. The storm lasted 4 days. In conventional cabins throughout the valley, families huddled as close to fireplaces and stoves as safety allowed. Wood consumption spiked. Some homesteaders burned a week's worth of fuel in those 4 days. Interior temperatures dropped despite continuous fires. Condensation formed on windows and froze instantly. Water buckets inside homes developed ice. Children slept in layers of clothing under every available blanket. William Pritchard's finest cabin, a showcase of his craftsmanship, held 48 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature during the storm's worst hours, despite a roaring fire consuming split pine at an alarming rate. The tall ceiling and proper ventilation he'd insisted on meant heat rose and escaped through necessary air gaps. The raised floor prevented ground moisture, but also eliminated any thermal mass benefit. It was, by conventional standards, an excellent cabin. By thermodynamic standards, it was a heat sieve. In the Kern barn shelter, something different was happening. Elias kept their small stove burning, but not aggressively, just enough to maintain comfort. The exterior storm raged against the barn's outer walls, but that fury stopped at the first barrier. Wind couldn't penetrate the double wall system. The thermal envelope held. The stone floor, having absorbed days of accumulated heat, radiated warmth from below. The low ceiling trapped warm air where people actually lived instead of letting it escape to unused space above. On the storm's third day, when Elias checked his thermometer, it read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference wasn't subtle. It was 76 degrees of protection, a gap so large it defied the criticism that had followed him since November. But numbers mean nothing if nobody sees them. Stay with me, because what happens next will show you why this stupid design humiliated every conventional cabin in the valley, and the measurements are about to get even more shocking. January 1882 brought temperatures that made December seem mild. Historical records from Fort Washakie, 30 miles northwest, documented sustained periods below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with several nights dropping below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. These weren't brief cold snaps. They were prolonged, deep freezes that tested every structure, every wood supply, and every family's endurance. By January 10th, Robert Hutchins had run out of firewood. He'd calculated his winter supply carefully based on 5 years of experience. For full cords of split pine, stored dry under cover. It should have lasted until March. But the exceptional cold and his cabin's continuous heat loss meant he'd burned through it by mid-January. He started burning furniture, first a broken chair, then a table his family didn't absolutely need. He wasn't alone. Throughout the valley, families faced similar crises. What that should have lasted months was disappearing in weeks. William Pritchard, the master carpenter, found himself in his own cabin chopping a decorative shelf into stove-sized pieces, cursing the winter that refused to give them a break. His showcase cabin, with its proper proportions and adequate ventilation, was bleeding heat so fast that keeping interior temperature above 45 degrees Fahrenheit required almost continuous fire. His hands were chapped and split from constant wood handling. His children wore coats indoors. His wife had stopped speaking to him about the cold because there was nothing to say. They were doing everything right by conventional wisdom, and it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, 3 miles north, Elias Kern was using roughly half a cord of wood per month. The difference became impossible to ignore when Hutchins stopped by on January 15th, ostensibly to check on the family, actually to see if the rumors were true. Elias invited him in. The contrast hit immediately. Outside temperature, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the Kern shelter, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the small thermometer hanging on the interior wall. Hutchins could feel it. This wasn't the desperate warmth of a space briefly heated and about to plunge cold again. This was stable, sustained warmth. The floor under his boots felt solid and not actively cold. The air didn't have the sharp chill that characterized his own cabin despite continuous fire. Margaret was kneading bread without wearing a coat. The girls were playing on the floor in normal dresses, not bundled in layers. A modest fire burned in the stove, not roaring, not consuming wood at an alarming rate, just burning steadily. How much were you using? Hutchins asked, pride fighting curiosity. About 2 armloads a day, Elias replied. 3 on the coldest nights. Hutchins was burning 6 to 8 armloads daily and still freezing. The math was undeniable. He looked around more carefully now, searching for the trick he'd missed. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet at the highest point. The windows were small and southern-facing. The walls showed no frost, no condensation. The stone floor that critics had predicted would suck heat from their bodies was actually radiating gentle warmth accumulated over days of thermal absorption. The stone, Hutchins said slowly. You're heating the stone, not the air. Didn't plan it that way, Elias admitted. But yes, that's what happens. Takes a day or two to warm up when you first start, but once it's warm, it stays warm. The fire's mostly maintaining it now, not fighting to heat everything from scratch every morning. Hutchins knelt and placed his palm on the floor. It wasn't hot, maybe 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but in a room where floors were typically the coldest point, having a floor warmer than the air was revolutionary. The entire thermal dynamic was inverted from conventional cabins. And the barn walls with your walls inside. I thought that would trap moisture. Thought so too, Elias said. But the barn logs aren't perfectly sealed. Enough air moves through to keep things dry without creating drafts we can feel. And the earth below, everyone said it would be damp, but it's actually wicking moisture down and away. Hutchins stood slowly. Outside, wind hammered the structure, but inside that fury was completely absent. The multi-layer protection, earth, outer walls, air gap, inner walls, livestock heat to the south, created a fortress against winter that his conventional cabin couldn't match. People are saying I should tear down my cabin and build like this, Hutchins said finally. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was admission. People are saying that. Cotton was in yesterday. Said his cabin hit 38 degrees inside during that 4-day storm, even with a fire going all night. He's asking questions about your setup. Word was spreading through a network of desperate, freezing families who'd reached the point where pride mattered less than survival. On January 23rd, William Pritchard showed up. No pleasantries, no pretense. I need to see inside. Elias showed him. Pritchard examined everything with a builder's eye. The stone floor, the double walls, the ceiling height, the stove placement, the chimney routing. He knocked on walls, checked corners, studied the foundation depth. His face showed the war between professional ego and undeniable evidence. Outside, minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill driving it lower. Inside, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Pritchard's own cabin that morning had measured 43 degrees Fahrenheit with a fire that had burned all night. The floor shouldn't work, Pritchard said finally. Conventional wisdom says ground contact bleeds heat. But you've got thermal mass working in reverse, storing heat instead of draining it. And this ceiling height. I've been building them tall for ventilation, but you're right. All I'm doing is heating empty space above where people live. He examined the double wall cavity. And this air gap with grass. It's essentially creating what wealthy homes back east are starting to call dead airspace insulation. You stumbled into modern building science. I stumbled into desperation, Elias corrected. No, Pritchard said quietly. You observed what worked and built accordingly. That's engineering, even if you didn't call it that. The master carpenter pulled a small notebook from his coat. I have 3 cabins scheduled for spring construction. The families have already paid deposits. Would you let me measure this place properly? Because I'm going to offer them a choice. Conventional cabin at the quoted price, or something based on your design for less money and better performance. By February, the temperature comparisons had become valley legend. Cotton kept detailed logs because he couldn't quite believe the numbers. February 3rd, outdoor temp. Minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit Cotton's cabin, conventional 47 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning continuously Kern's barn shelter. 64 degrees Fahrenheit, moderate firewood consumption. Cotton used 7 loads, Kern used February 2nd, 11. Outdoor temp. Minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit Hutchins cabin. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, fire pushed to maximum Kern shelter. 59 degrees Fahrenheit, normal firewood consumption. Hutchins used 8 loads. Kern used February 3rd, 18. Outdoor temp. Minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit Pritchard's finest cabin. 51 degrees Fahrenheit, aggressive. Fire Kern shelter. 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Modest firewood consumption. Pritchard used 6 loads. Kern used 2.5. The numbers couldn't be disputed. Across the entire winter season, Elias Kern's desperate improvisation consumed roughly half the wood of conventional cabins while maintaining interior temperatures 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. On the coldest nights, the difference was even more dramatic, sometimes 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than neighbors' homes. But the most striking measurement came in late February when the first warm spell arrived. Outdoor temperatures climbed to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, almost balmy after weeks of brutal cold. Conventional cabins warmed quickly, losing their accumulated cold within hours. The Kern shelter stayed at 63 degrees Fahrenheit, barely changing from its deep winter temperature because the thermal mass, once charged, didn't respond to brief temperature swings. Margaret recorded in her diary, "Elias was right about the stones. They remember the heat we give them and give it back slowly. I feel foolish for doubting him." In March, as winter finally broke, families throughout the valley faced a reckoning with their empty wood piles, damaged pride, and the undeniable evidence that the man they'd mocked had built something extraordinary through nothing more than careful observation and desperate necessity. Spring 1882 arrived late in the Wind River Valley, as it always did. Snow persisted into early April, but the brutal cold had finally broken. Families emerged from winter assessing damage, to structures, to wood supplies, and to assumptions about what constituted proper frontier housing. Elias Kern had survived his first Wyoming winter with 3/4 of his original woodpile still stacked and covered. His family had remained healthy, warm, and reasonably comfortable through temperatures that had pushed conventional cabins to their limits. The barn shelter he'd built out of desperation and improvisation had outperformed every traditionally constructed dwelling within 50 miles. The social transformation didn't happen overnight. It started quietly. In mid-April, Robert Hutchins appeared at the Kern place with his 2 sons and a wagon loaded with tools. He didn't apologize for the months of mockery. Frontier men rarely did. Instead, he made a simple request. "Would you help me modify my barn before next winter?" Elias walked him through the principles. Not because he'd suddenly become an expert, but because Hutchins genuinely wanted to understand. They discussed floor excavation depth, double wall spacing, thermal mass placement, ceiling height optimization, and the counterintuitive benefit of semi-permeable outer walls for moisture management. The part one got wrong, Hutchins admitted as they examined his conventional cabin's raised floor, was thinking that separating from the ground prevented heat loss. But ground isn't the enemy, it's stable. It's the air that's the enemy, especially moving air. You blocked wind, captured stable earth temperature, and stored heat in mass. I was fighting all three. Within 2 weeks, Hutchins had begun converting a section of his barn into family quarters using Kern's design principles. He excavated deeper than Elias had, 24 inches, and used larger stones for thermal mass. He kept detailed notes on the process, measurements, and material costs. His conclusion, shared at the general store in early May, costs about 60% of conventional cabin construction. Maybe less if you're starting from scratch and designing the barn and living quarters together instead of retrofitting like I am. That statement reached ears that had been waiting for economic justification. William Pritchard faced a professional crisis. 3 families had deposits down for spring cabin construction. All 3 had heard the winter stories. All 3 now wanted something different for what Pritchard had built his reputation on. The carpenter spent 2 full days at the Kern shelter in late April, measuring everything with professional precision. He filled a notebook with calculations, sketches, and observations. When he finally looked up from his measurements, he addressed Elias directly. "I can't pretend I invented this. If I'm going to build these for other families, I need to be honest about where the design came from." "It's not really a design," Elias protested. "It's just what worked." "That's exactly what design is," Pritchard replied. "Everything else is just decoration." The first Pritchard-built barn cabin went up in June 1882 for the Morrison family, newly arrived from Illinois. Pritchard incorporated what he'd learned from Kern, but added refinements from his carpentry experience: better window placement for light, improved door sealing, more efficient stove positioning. He called it a semi-sheltered, integrated barn dwelling in his contract, but everyone in the valley called it a Kern style. By August, 2 more were under construction. The adoption spread through networks of necessity rather than marketing. A family suffering through their first Wyoming winter would hear about the Kern place. They'd visit, see the interior, hear the numbers. Word carried weight when backed by survival data. Thomas Cotton, the rancher who'd lost his Montana cousin to cold, became an unexpected advocate. At a territorial meeting in Lander that summer, he presented comparative data he'd collected, In conventional cabins, we're seeing winter wood consumption of 5 to 7 cords. The current style designs are running 2.5 to 3.5 cords for the same period, same temperatures. That's not marginal improvement. That's transformative, especially for families on limited means. The economic argument proved more persuasive than the thermal engineering. Wyoming settlers lived on tight margins. Cutting wood consumption by half meant less time in dangerous weather, less physical labor, more resources for other needs. It meant the difference between barely surviving winter and having a buffer for spring planting. Not everyone converted. Some homesteaders couldn't afford the modification costs. Others found the aesthetic unacceptable. Living underground still carried social stigma, even with proven performance. Pride kept some families in freezing cabins rather than admit Kern had found a better way. But by November 1882, as the second winter approached, the valley had changed. Historical records from the Fremont County Land Office show modifications to at least 12 existing barn structures and 4 new construction projects explicitly described as earth-sheltered barn dwellings between spring and fall of 1882. Margaret Kern noted in her November diary, "Strange to have visitors now asking Elias's advice, when last year those same people thought him foolish. He answers their questions with the same quiet patience he showed when they mocked him. I suppose that's the difference between a man who knows he's right and one who needs to prove it." The winter of 1882 to 83 provided the final validation. It was milder than the previous year, fewer extreme temperature events, less sustained deep cold. But the comparative performance remained consistent. Current-style structures used roughly half the wood of conventional cabins while maintaining higher interior temperatures. William Pritchard kept systematic records on the 3 cabins he'd built that year. Morrison family, current-style barn cabin average winter interior temp, 58 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumption, 3.1 cords family health. No cold-related illness Davidson family, conventional Pritchard cabin, built 1880 average winter interior temp, 49 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumption, 6.2 cords family health. 2 children with respiratory illness Hutchins family, modified barn conversion average winter interior temp, 61 degrees Fahrenheit total. Wood consumption, 2. 8 cords family health. No cold-related illness. The data eliminated arguments about luck or exceptional circumstances. The design worked. It worked consistently. It worked for different families in different locations under different conditions. By spring 1883, Pritchard had 6 more contracts for current-style construction. Other builders in the territory began offering similar designs. The innovation spread beyond the Wind River Valley. Mentions appear in territorial newspapers from Rock Springs, Evanston, and South Pass City. A letter to the Cheyenne Daily Leader in March 1883 describes the increasingly popular semi-dugout barn dwellings proving remarkably efficient in our severe climate. Robert Hutchins, who'd been among the first and loudest critics, became one of the design's most vocal advocates. At a territorial agricultural meeting in 1884, he presented on integrated livestock and living quarters for frontier efficiency. His presentation included detailed cost comparisons, thermal performance data, and construction guidance. When asked about Elias Kern, Hutchins gave rare frontier praise. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He just observed what worked and built accordingly. Sometimes the best engineering comes from people who don't know enough to believe something's impossible. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The desperate improvisation that neighbors had mocked had become the recommended standard. The stupid design that supposedly violated every principle of sound construction had become the subject of how-to guides and builder recommendations. The man who'd been pitted for his poverty had accidentally revolutionized frontier housing in his region. Elias himself remained largely unaffected by the attention. He farmed his homestead, raised his daughters, and maintained his barn shelter with the same practical approach he'd used to build it. When asked by a visiting journalist in 1885 about his invention, he demurred, "I didn't invent anything. I just couldn't afford to waste heat, so I built something that wouldn't." But the numbers told a different story. By 1885, Territorial records suggest at least 47 structures in western Wyoming incorporated significant elements of the Kern design: earth sheltering, thermal mass floors, double wall construction, integrated barn heat, or optimized ceiling heights. Some were direct copies. Others were adaptations that kept the thermal principles while modifying aesthetics or layout. The design spread eventually slowed as railroad access improved and milled lumber became more affordable, making conventional construction economically viable. Changing architectural trends and the decline of small-scale homesteading reduced demand for ultra-efficient frontier housing. By the early 1900s, few new Kern-style structures were being built, but those that existed lasted. The original Kern barn shelter remained occupied by the family until 1903, when they built a larger conventional home after 21 years of prosperity. The barn cabin was maintained as secondary housing and storage. County records show it stood until at least 1928, outlasting many conventional cabins built in the same era. The thermal principles Elias accidentally discovered through desperate observation would eventually become standard elements of passive solar design, earth-sheltered architecture, and thermal mass construction, all modern innovations that vindicated techniques a struggling farmer had implemented out of necessity in 1881. There's a pattern in frontier history that modern efficiency culture often misses. Some of the most effective solutions emerge not from expertise or abundant resources, but from constraint-driven observation. Elias Kern wasn't a thermal engineer. He hadn't studied architectural theory or heat transfer physics. He had no access to the research that would later validate his design choices. What he had was acute awareness born from necessity, the kind of attention to detail that emerges when failure means your family freezes. He noticed that root cellars stayed warmer in winter than surface structures. He observed that earth temperature remained stable while air temperature swung wildly. He recognized that his livestock generated heat that dissipated into empty air. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that still air insulates while moving air steals warmth. He saw that conventional cabin design prioritized appearance and tradition over thermal performance. From these observations, made under pressure with limited options, he assembled a system that accidentally incorporated multiple advanced thermal principles: earth-coupled thermal mass, passive solar gain, multi-layer envelope insulation, thermal stratification control, and integrated passive heating. The barn shelter he built that desperate October wasn't perfect. The ceiling was oppressively low. Natural light was limited. The proximity to livestock created odors and maintenance challenges. Living partially underground violated social norms and carried psychological weight for his family. But it kept them alive and comfortable through winters that pushed conventional housing to failure. It did so while consuming half the resources and requiring less constant attention. These weren't marginal improvements. They were transformative differences that affected daily survival. The mockery Elias endured came from people who weren't necessarily wrong in their understanding. They were operating on conventional wisdom that worked adequately under normal conditions. Build above ground to avoid moisture. Provide ventilation to prevent condensation. Create tall ceilings for air circulation. These principles had historical justification. What they missed was context. Those principles optimized for different priorities: appearance, social acceptability, construction tradition. They didn't optimize for thermal efficiency under extreme conditions with limited resources. Elias's desperation forced him to optimize for a single metric: keeping his family warm with minimal fuel. That focus eliminated every consideration that didn't directly serve that goal. The result looked wrong because it violated conventions, but it performed right because it aligned with physics. This pattern, conventional wisdom failing under pressure, desperate improvisation succeeding through observation, repeats throughout frontier history. The sod houses of Nebraska that established homesteaders mocked, but which survived prairie fires and tornadoes. The dugout shelters of Kansas that looked primitive but maintained stable temperatures year-round. The earth lodge designs of native peoples that settlers dismissed as backwards, but which demonstrated sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics. Modern building science has vindicated these primitive approaches. Earth-sheltered housing, passive solar design, thermal mass construction, super insulation. These are now cutting-edge, sustainable building techniques. They're marketed as innovations when they're actually rediscoveries of principles that desperate frontier families figured out through observation and necessity. The Kern barn shelter represents something larger than one family's winter survival. It demonstrates that expertise isn't the only path to effective solutions. Sometimes, perhaps often, the people closest to consequences find answers that experts miss. Not because they're smarter, but because they're paying attention to different things. Elias watched heat behavior because his daughter's survival depended on it. William Pritchard, the master carpenter, watched construction tradition because his reputation depended on it. Different priorities, different observations, different conclusions. When winter provided objective measurement, physics didn't care about tradition or reputation. The structure that best aligned with thermodynamic reality performed best, regardless of who designed it or why. For modern homesteaders, off-grid builders, and anyone interested in resilient housing, the Kern story offers practical lessons. Thermal mass matters. Heavy materials that can absorb and slowly release heat create stability that lightweight construction cannot match. The stone floor that critics called a heat sink was actually a heat battery. Earth coupling provides free thermal stability. Ground temperature, at even modest depth, remains far more stable than air temperature. Building in contact with that stability reduces the energy needed for heating and cooling. Multi-layer envelopes outperform single barriers. The air gap between Kern's interior and exterior walls created insulation more effective than either wall alone. Modern building science calls this continuous insulation. Kern called it what I could afford. Lower ceilings waste less heat. Heating volume above where people actually live is thermodynamic waste. Keeping ceilings at functional minimum reduces the total heat required. Passive heat sources compound. Livestock, composting, earth temperature, solar gain. Individually modest, but combined they reduce active heating requirements significantly. These aren't exotic principles requiring advanced technology. They're observations about how heat behaves, implemented through basic construction. They were accessible to a struggling farmer in 1881, and they remain accessible now. The economics remain compelling. Kern's construction cost less than conventional cabins while performing better. Modern implementations of similar principles, earth-sheltered homes, passive solar designs, thermal mass construction, typically show 40 to 60% reductions in heating and cooling costs compared to conventional construction. The payback period on slightly higher initial construction costs runs 5 to 10 years, after which the savings are pure economic benefit. But perhaps the deeper lesson is about knowledge itself. We live in an era that privileges formal expertise, certified knowledge, and officially sanctioned methods. These have value. Elias Kern might have benefited from understanding heat transfer equations. But they're not the only path to effective solutions. Sometimes the person shivering in an inadequate structure pays more useful attention than the comfortable expert explaining why that structure should theoretically work. Sometimes desperation produces better observation than confidence. Sometimes this stupid approach that violates conventional wisdom is actually the smart approach that aligns with underlying reality. The neighbors who laughed at Elias Kern weren't cruel people. They were people operating on reasonable assumptions that worked adequately most of the time. When those assumptions met extreme conditions and limited resources, they failed. What looked like foolishness, building human housing inside a barn, digging into the earth, creating oppressively low ceilings, investing in stone floors, turned out to be sophisticated thermal engineering arrived at through desperate observation rather than formal training. Winter 1881 to 82 in the Wind River Valley wasn't just a weather event. It was a natural experiment that measured the gap between conventional wisdom and physical reality. The thermometer didn't care about social status, construction tradition, or who looked foolish. It measured only one thing: which structures kept people warmer with less fuel. Elias Kern's barn shelter won that measurement by margins too large to dismiss. And in doing so, it demonstrated something worth remembering. The wisdom to survive often comes not from knowing the right answers, but from observing the right questions and having the courage to trust what you see over what you're told. His family stayed 70 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, not because he was smarter than his neighbors, but because he was desperate enough to pay attention and brave enough to act on what he observed. Sometimes that's all innovation requires. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Have you ever had to improvise shelter or heating in extreme conditions? And if you found value in this story of frontier innovation, hit that subscribe button because every week I bring you one real survival technique that actually worked when lives depended on it. The old ways weren't backward. They were battle-tested solutions waiting to be rediscovered. Educational note, this narrative presents historical principles of thermal design and frontier construction for educational purposes. Modern building projects should comply with local codes, engineering standards, and safety regulations. While the thermal principles described are scientifically valid, implementation requires proper planning, professional consultation, and attention to modern safety requirements including structural engineering, fire safety, moisture management, and ventilation standards.